Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Isaiah from Therapy Today, and I am joined by a special guest today, Fred Liggin. And the reason that I have him on is because he has a lot of experience working with people who have been displaced and what we're talking about today, primarily homelessness, especially in light of the recent natural disasters in the southeast US. There are a lot of people who are struggling with being displaced from their homes now. And so I thought it'd be really timely for him to come on and talk through, bust some of the myths around what homelessness means, how that interacts with mental health, trauma, and other things that I don't even have a clue about. So that's why I brought in an expert to talk about it.
My name is Fred Liggin. I am lead pastor at Williamsburg Christian Church. I am founder and one of the directors at 3E Restoration Incorporated, nonprofit community development agency to alleviate poverty and to train communities to become more trauma responsive. I am a clinical trauma professional, and my postgraduate work centers on the intersection between theology, racialized cultural systems, and collective trauma. I've been walking with folks out of social displacement and through social displacement for the last 22 years of my life.
Before we dive into this, please do like and subscribe. Follow us to get more content about mental health and how that relates to our own individual mental health journeys and our society as a whole. So Fred, thank you for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for letting me on. I'm a fan of the channel.
I appreciate that,
Yeah,
man.
for real.
I think one of the most common myths that people will talk about whenever the topic of homelessness comes up, that there are so many businesses that you can just see. There's help wanted, or they're hiring. And so like people will say, well, why don't these people just, get a job and then they wouldn't be homeless anymore? Like,
Right.
what's the story with that?
Right. It's a good thought. I appreciate the logic that may be behind that idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are two factors at work. One, we'll just talk about the most practical factor.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a place to shower and
Yeah.
you don't have a place to wash your clothes,
Mm-hmm.
how are you going to wash your uniform?
Right.
How are you going to not come in wrinkled?
Sure.
How are you going to come out in such a way that it's clean hygiene? And most of the time people are always talking about, why don't neighbors living through homelessness get restaurant jobs?
Mm-hmm.
Well, is that what you want?
Right.
To see? It's not. And neighbors living through homelessness know that's not what they want to see, because it's not what they want to be.
Sure.
So it's not just, okay, go get a job. It's where am I going to wash my clothes? It's where am I going to iron my clothes? It's how am I going to keep my hygiene straight? Not only that, if they get enough money in a paycheck to be able to buy a hotel room, let's say they can work that 2 weeks. Let's say that they can get away with carrying all their stuff to a workplace in 3 or 4 days worth of a uniform, may not wash, may not be washed, certainly may not be ironed.
Yeah.
Their hygiene may not be what they want it to be. Let's say they can get past the pay period for that.
Okay.
And then they can get into a paycheck and they can get into a hotel. Is that still sustainable? Because now we're talking about, where's the hotel? What about the transportation? Does the bus route go up there? What if it's an early morning breakfast job? Can they get there at 6 a.m.? In Williamsburg, the bus stop doesn't start until 6 a.m. If they work late until 11:30, do they have the money to Uber? And now have we spent money on Ubering? There's so many issues associated with this that's just practical. But let's talk about mental health.
Okay.
A person living through homelessness has been displaced, which means they are now living through a traumagenic experience. Now, what that means is, just like everybody watching probably has had stress headaches before, or stress stomach aches before, or sweaty palms when you get nervous, or dry mouth when you're nervous, that tells you that stress is a physiological response.
Yeah.
That your body responds to an external, outside force in an internal way that changes how you physiologically operate.
Yeah.
Live in that. Live in it in such a way that now you're not just in stress, acute stress, or episodic stress, which is stress that comes and goes. You're not even in chronic stress, which is stress that comes, stays, and then eventually goes. You're in traumatic stress, because traumatic stress is not having an ability to control the circumstances or the power over the circumstances when your life is threatened. Or you're vulnerable to the degree that your well-being is threatened.
Okay.
So in the shorthand of trauma is too much, too fast, too soon, too long. And when you feel as though your ability to respond to what's happening to you is overwhelmed, your life is vulnerable, your well-being is threatened, your brain and body are going to completely activate in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Your nervous system could rupture, your brain system, and by rupture, I don't mean medically ruptured, it can get twisted. That's the term, right? Like a ruptured nervous system. It gets kind of twisted up. Our neurological operations get twisted up. So think of a stress headache deciding to just call your body a home.
Right.
Think of a stress stomach ache as calling your body a home.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's going to happen is you're not going to be living out of your thinking part of your brain. You're going to be living out of the survival part of your brain, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So let's say you get a job in a kitchen, and the kitchen is intense.
Yeah,
well, you're already showing up to work with a high level of anxiety. Are you really going to hold that job?
Right.
It's going to be hard.
For sure.
Not only that, it's just going to be hard to function to keep a schedule. I imagine most people watching this channel would admit that when we're genuinely stressed out, we're not always clearest in our mind. We're a little foggy-headed sometimes.
That's true for everybody.
I mean, well, neurologically it is. Whether we've experienced it or not, who knows? But it is true. Homelessness, not having any means by which you can orient yourself toward a life-giving narrative, not having a place of shelter, not knowing where you're going to be next week.
Yeah.
The comfort of a place called home, not having that. And we're not even talking about the social implications of this right now. The things they've heard walking down the street that my friends have told me who lived through homelessness they've heard. You're not going to function at your best. You're not going to be at your fullest capacity. Your brain, nervous system, and story is going to intersect in such a way that it's not going to sustain what you hope to sustain.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be because our neighbors living through homelessness aren't hard workers. Or that they are somehow less intelligent. They're none of those things.
Right.
They're just as intelligent, hardworking, just as gifted, talented as any of us. Their brain and nervous system is undergoing significant stress in a traumagenic event, and their brain and body and their story is in a collision, and they're not functioning at full capacity. So we used to tell people in 3E all the time, if you get your friend living through social displacement a job, the very first week you meet them, go ahead and have a second job lined up. No call, no shows, probably. Anxiety, handle it well, handle boss, handle coworkers better.
Yeah.
Not living in survival brain, not when fight, flight, freeze, and fawn has been the way of living for the last 8 months, a year, 2 years, 10 years.
Yeah. So what you mean is like the practical limitations, like you talk about, the hygiene and the lack of control over their environment also translates into kind of the mental health, I don't want to say limitations, but the challenges that they face in terms of keeping a job, especially the kinds of jobs that might be available that would be more intense, difficult hours, and a lot of the things that we take for granted, like transportation, safety, all those things.
Yeah, and we also act like our friends living through homelessness are somehow pleased with their appearance. I had a friend one time, and he became a dear friend of mine, and he had no substance use disorders, but he had lived through homelessness long enough that his teeth were not like my teeth.
Sure.
And I don't have the best teeth. But he had not been able to go to a dentist for years. He couldn't brush his teeth consistently. When he was housed, he was always afraid to smile. And he did not feel comfortable in a job that required him to smile because he did not like his own appearance.
Yeah.
So he went to a dentist, a friend of ours, one of our coaches in our network, took care of him, replaced some teeth, helped him out. And man, I'm telling you, it was just a totally different thing. And that may sound cosmetic.
Yeah.
But that's real.
For sure.
I mean, you and I brushed our hair and put on some, decent clothes to be on the screen because we care. It matters.
Yes.
And it's going to be forever archived.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this matters. When we dehumanize the needs of our very human neighbors living through homelessness, we then move outside of logic.
Okay.
And we think, well, just get a job. Here are some factors as to why that's an oversimplification and reduction.
For sure. So I think you've addressed on this already, but the second myth is, I'm not giving money to a homeless person. They'll just buy drugs or waste it.
Yeah. From a faith-based standpoint, there's a proverb that I always remember in Proverbs 19:17 that says, kindness to the poor is a loan to the Lord, and he will reward the lender. So if I'm of the Jewish tradition, if I'm of the Jewish faith and the Hebrew scriptures, if I'm of the Christian faith and the Christian tradition, we share this in common, that to give to a person living through poverty is not to give to them, it's to give to the Lord.
Okay.
Kindness to the poor is a loan to the Lord, and he'll reward the lender. It matters deeply to me, but practically speaking, sure, they might. But the statistics are
Okay.
The overwhelming amount of people living through homelessness develop substance use disorders as a result of homelessness.
Okay.
That's not the precursor.
I see.
So sometimes baked in that assumption is they drugged themselves or drank themselves, and being crass here, into homelessness.
Yeah.
That is a minority statistic.
Okay.
And in my 20 plus years of walking with people out of this, it is a minority statistic. Coping behaviors that are not healthy are picked up by our neighbors living through homelessness, just like coping behaviors are picked up by all of us who are not homeless when we stress eat, or when we stress workout, or when we stress work, right? When we take on these other ways of trying to escape our circumstances, it's no different than what our neighbors living through homelessness are doing.
Yeah.
But the facts are, they're not just taking your money and buying drugs.
Sure.
Many times they're taking your money and saving it for a hotel, buying a bus pass, or trying to get something to eat. And yes, those who live with substance use disorder may absolutely use that money, but it is to cope.
Yeah.
And it's important that you remember the why.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you're talking about with different unhealthy coping skills that we might have, we just have the benefit of more of a safety net.
Yeah. And we also have the benefit of nobody judging us.
Yeah.
Because my midnight bowls of cereal while my wife is asleep and I'm sneaking down the stairs to get one because I knew she'd have something to say about it. That's a true story, by the way. You don't get a body like this and not do that. That's a true story. Nobody's judging me. Nobody is holding a box of cereal outside my door saying, I'll give it to you, but not at midnight.
The next myth, I think, ties into what you're talking about, and all of these are really connected because I think they come from very similar assumptions.
Yeah.
But the idea that public assistance or anything that's free, I guess, creates dependence.
I'm sorry to laugh at that. I hear that one the most.
I'm sure you do, especially when we're in like a political cycle. That kind of stuff will come up all the time.
And it's so, if I may say so, it is so nearsighted because I know for a fact you got in a car you didn't build that you bought, but you drove on a road that you didn't pave that you pay for, given to you through your taxes. We live in a society that is inherited. So first off, if I am a person of the disposition of faith, we have to reckon with the theology of grace and we have to reckon with the theology of mercy. If I'm not a person coming at this from a faith standpoint, then I have to reckon with something called cultural anthropology and how societies are formed. We inherit what we have. We didn't earn it. It's given to us.
Yeah.
Even if we pay for some things. So that's an aside. I could talk more about that and connect it, but let's hold that for a minute. Let's talk about this idea of public assistance. So in the 60s, when these entitlement programs were designed, our country was in an affordable housing crisis for, I think, the third time in our nation's short history, and sort of in a post-industrial, in an industrial age and post-industrial age. And we needed help.
Sure.
And the fact is, we live in a moment where the rent's high.
Yeah.
Affordable housing is not a thing.
Right.
Jobs have not come up to a living wage, and one can argue what that may or may not mean, but here's what I know. If the average affordable rent in James City County, Williamsburg, James City County is about $1,400, and I make $11 an hour wage job, and I work 40 hours a week, and I am a single mom, come on now.
Yeah.
And I've got a car payment. Maybe I don't have a car payment. Maybe I just take bus transit. So that's about $40, $50 a pass a month. So that's not so bad.
Okay.
So let's say I take bus transit. But I have utilities associated with that.
Sure.
If I have a child, I have child needs. Let's not even talk about the fact that I might have to have daycare or childcare for my child in order, right? You see where I'm going? Then math doesn't add up.
Right.
So these safety net programs, which is what they were designed to be, are for folks who need a safety net. Now, what most people don't know about these safety net programs is they come with heavy restrictions. Like you have to work a minimum number of hours in order to qualify for SNAP, which we used to call food stamps.
Okay.
Come on, man. People don't know that. You only have so many months in your life of social credit to get on what we used to call welfare. Yeah, people don't realize these things have expiration dates.
Yeah.
They have qualifications. You can't keep having them babies and getting them checks.
Yeah.
You can't keep doing that's a false politicized narrative that just absolutely is not true. It doesn't bear to the actual facts of the policy, much less to how it's applied. And every single locality has fraud, police, for lack of a better term, fraud deputies. James City County is one that looks at the amount of fraud that has taken place, and it is almost always less than a percentage point. So it's amazing how our ideology works into an interpretation of the facts, right?
For sure.
And it's amazing at how we'll allow that interpretation of the facts grounded in our ideology make us discompassionate and frankly just illogical.
I think that's an interesting point, because I think, as we talked about in the beginning, that there are a lot of people who are displaced now through a very public reason, and how that may or may not shape the narrative around people who are struggling with homelessness.
Right.
When those people may seem more similar to us than we normally assume.
Right. Or they're not even homeless. They are hard-working people.
Yeah.
But they're working in minimum wage jobs, trying to live in an affordable rent locality that is outside of the scope of a minimum wage job, where they have to take 2 jobs. They need a little help with the groceries.
Sure.
On the regular, much less when the milk is expensive for all of us.
Yeah.
But the difference between them and me is I have a job that doesn't pay me less than a living wage. And I get to combine incomes.
Yeah.
Like, there's lots of differences. But we don't think through sometimes just the economics, just the math. So most people don't know. I would wonder, of the people watching this, how many of them know what the average affordable rent price in their locality is if they live outside of Williamsburg.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know the average affordable rent in your locality, then just opt not to have an opinion about entitlement programs until you know how the math adds up in your own place.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
If I live in Nova, Northern Virginia,
oh my God,
you see what I'm saying? Like, now we're at a whole different level.
Yeah.
But you know what doesn't change? Minimum wage.
Yeah.
Doesn't change.
Let me come at this. Let's say there is somebody who is well-intentioned towards one of their homeless friends who are struggling with homelessness. But they might think, anything I do won't be enough to make a difference.
Yeah, that's fair. So the very first encounter I ever had with a man living through homelessness, his name was Mr. Clifford. He was, I didn't know his name was Mr. Clifford at the time. I was a stockbroker at the time, and I kept seeing this man standing at the corner of the same street every morning, every afternoon, on my way to work, on my way home. And I decided one day I needed to stop and just see if I could help this man. That was my idea, help him. Okay. And he would stand slouching over his buggy filled with things. And so me being a Christian, I did what good evangelical Christians do. I grabbed a Bible, of course, and I grabbed some free food coupons, of course, and I filled it up. And I went to him, and he was sitting on the wall, kind of leaning into his buggy on the corner of this street. It was 2nd and Veterans Parkway in Columbus, Georgia. And he just sat there, and I said, "Hey, my name is Fred. I've got a Bible and some free coupons if you would like them for food." Without looking at me, he held his hand out, he grabbed it, and he threw it in the buggy with all the other Bibles and free food coupons that was in there. And I said, "My name is Fred." And I held my hand out. He kept his head down, didn't reach his hand out. Didn't respond. I said, "Well, may I sit with you a minute?" And he just nodded his head. And so I sat with him on that wall in the corner of Veterans and 2nd, and sat there for what felt like, it just felt like a long time. And at some point, after sitting there in my suit, as he's sitting in his clothes by his buggy, I get up and I say, "Well, thank you for letting me sit with you." And then he looked up and he held his hand out and he said, "Clifford, my name is Clifford." And we shook hands. And what I learned from Mr. Clifford that day and from every day forward is that more than my help, he wanted my presence. He wanted company.
Okay.
You can buy a cup of coffee for a neighbor and sit with them, and don't ask them how they got homeless, how did you end up this way. Just treat them like you would treat anybody else. Where are you from? This is where I'm from. This is who I am. You'll be surprised what a cup of coffee can do. Most of the neighbors I've ever met living through homelessness want to be seen in their humanity, not in their circumstances. There's nothing more you can give someone than your presence, because there's nothing more valuable in our society than our time. I mean, we commodify our time for paychecks.
For sure.
That's how valuable we think our time is. just giving your time to a neighbor, man, that can be life-giving. And then from there,
Yeah.
sure, you might be able to find out where some resources are. You might be able to help coordinate some systems of care for this neighbor. You might be able to call a 3E or a church, or get your church involved, or talk to your folks. Talk to your friends and say, I've met this friend who has this issue, who's living through homelessness, and he has this issue that he's trying to navigate with this. There's so many different ways that you might be able to do more.
Yeah.
But do not think that being present with someone and sharing a cup of coffee or a meal is doing less.
That's a good point. And so I want to go back to what you talked about with some of the trauma that goes into this experience and these circumstances that some people are struggling through. And people might say like, well, okay, so I sit with them, or even if we get to a point where we have a relationship, but they're still in these circumstances and they're still dealing with that traumatic stress, how can I help them with that?
If I had an answer to that, bro, the whole thing would change. It's going to be based on the individual.
Okay.
Some of our neighbors are going to live with serious mental health conditions, and it's going to be way outside of the scope of our knowledge to help them. I mean, if they're living with a dissociative identity disorder or some other type of personality disorder, if they're living with some form of serious mental health, that really is a hard thing for their life.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, at that point, finding out who in the community has worked with that neighbor, and then there's confidentiality issues. I mean, there's so many different factors with this, right? Which is why I think it's always important for people to find agencies already doing the work. Like, find the professionals doing it.
Yeah.
And let the professional be the professional.
Sure.
And you be the neighbor.
Yeah.
Right?
That makes sense.
As a pastor, I always say to people, let your pastor be your pastor, your friend be your friend, and your therapist be your therapist. Just know where the lanes are in the highway of your life.
Yes.
Right? Weave in and out fine, but don't make your friend your therapist.
Right.
Right? Like, let's not do that.
Yeah.
And don't think your pastor's one either, right? Like, get a real therapist.
Hey, I'm on board with that.
I know you are, and I am too. But I think the same thing goes when it comes to walking with neighbors, living through homelessness and living through trauma. What you can absolutely know, it's a 10 out of 10 that every person living through homelessness is in trauma response.
Okay.
It's a 10 out of 10 because of what traumatic stress is clinically.
Yeah.
A lack of any effective control of power in the midst of vulnerability or life-threatening circumstance. That's like a clinical definition of traumatic stress. Every one of them are in traumatic stress. Let's not even talk about the other aggressions, micro and macro, that they feel living in a society, which is why we talk about it as social displacement, where they don't belong, where they're panhandling. No, they're just trying to get out of the rain. Where they're panhandling. No, they're just trying to get out of the cold. Where they're panhandling. No, they're just trying to get out of the heat, right? But they're panhandling.
Yeah.
Right? They're loitering. Maybe they're not actually panhandling and asking for money. They're just loitering. Like, that's the language for it, right? Are now with the Supreme Court Justice passing this law that basically permits localities to criminalize homelessness because now it becomes illegal for them to publicly encamp.
Oh.
Right? That's a thing. That's just July, I believe, is when that court case went through, if I'm not mistaken. So now they don't even know, like, when they sleep at night, will I be seen by an officer? Will I be charged? Will I be taken to jail? Those are real things. So, yeah, the trauma is real.
Yeah.
If you really want to help, then find an agency that's doing the work and ask them if you can pay for a hotel night or 2 or 3 or 7.
Yeah.
Get your church involved and ask them to pay for a night, 2 or 3 or 7.
Yeah.
Find out where the day centers are, where they can go during the day. We have one here in town, but not all towns have one. We didn't have one 9 years ago. So we didn't even have a day center a decade ago.
Yeah.
Right? So the smaller localities generally won't even have the resources we have worked really hard over the last 10 years, over the last 15 years to build.
Yeah.
10 to 15 years. So larger cities, larger places, you'll see lines for days just to get into the day center because it's just a maximum occupancy issue, right? All of that is associated with the traumatic stress they're living through. You cannot, unfortunately, and neither can I, heal the wound, which is what the word trauma means, that they carry.
Yeah.
What we can do is make sure they don't carry it alone.
Got it.
And there are many different ways to be with neighbors. Rather than trying to do things for them and to them, but first doing things with them.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
So when you're with a friend, so like Mr. Clifford,
Uh-huh.
like before I knew his name, he was just a dude
Right.
living through homelessness
Mm-hmm.
that I felt bad for,
Yeah.
right, in my own privilege and stuff. Then he became Mr. Clifford, the Vietnam veteran,
Hmm.
who came back not the same.
Yeah.
And his family didn't know what to do with the man who was not the same.
Uh-huh.
And that man turned inward and thought that the best thing for him to do was to not cause his family that pain.
Wow.
And so he left. And he'd been on the street ever since.
Wow.
Right? You don't know these stories. And you talked about earlier about the natural disasters. You think about Florida and all the people who didn't have their houses insured because the way the insurance system is there because of insurance companies pulling out of Florida because of the floods or because of the hurricanes.
Yeah.
You know, what we just saw twice. I've met neighbors who were displaced because their house burned down.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't drink themselves out. They didn't lose their job and couldn't pay their bills they just couldn't recover.
Yeah.
We need to listen more and take a posture of curiosity rather than thinking we can solve the problem at first.
Mm-hmm.
And then after we learn what the problem is, we can organize locally to solve it. The one problem we cannot solve for anybody is their trauma. What we can do is be a part of their healing journey, which almost always, and you know this as a therapist, having relational attachments to people can increase our self-worth and can help increase our self-regulation, our ability to regulate our emotions, right?
Yeah.
Like once we are in that and learning how to be human again, right? To be the human that we want to be, we can find healing in that journey.
Yeah.
Nothing's different for neighbors living through homelessness.
What would be your final note to people who encounter somebody who is living through homelessness?
If you can, learn their name and share yours.
Okay.
And call them by name when you see them.
Yeah. All right. Nice and simple.
We'll just start and end there
Yeah.
because I've already talked enough about all the other things.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for bringing your experience and your attitude of graciousness towards this conversation. I think both towards people who are struggling through homelessness as well as for the people who don't have the same perspective and experience that you've built up over the years. And so I think that's a really helpful perspective to add to this conversation as we encounter people almost on a daily basis who are struggling in that capacity in one way or another. So thank you for being on the channel. For all of you watching, again, this is Fred. He's got tons of experience. Encourage you to check out the organization that he founded and works with now, 3E Restoration, and they're doing some awesome work here locally. So again, please do like and subscribe. That helps the channel to grow, and we will catch you all next time.